As I read about the next dog, Snowball, think about how this dog is different from Cookie. After we read today, I'll ask you to write something good about Snowball to help people remember her after she died. Snowball, the first dog. Mother stood looking down at the puppy I was holding. "This one," I said. "I want this one." It was a little black female with a perfect white circle on its side, and I clutched it close to my chest and saw only the puppy, me, and the endless possibilities. I did not realize how impossible the situation happened to be. I was just 7 years old. We were in a mountain village in the Philippine Islands in 1946, where my mother and father had come on a sort of work vacation getaway trip. My father was in the army there, and my mother and I had taken a troop ship from San Francisco to be with him. The dog represented a problem in more ways than one. We lived in a strictly controlled base housing, such as it was, and Mother wasn't sure if dogs were allowed, but that was just for openers. The village we were visiting raised dogs for food. I had just, to my utter 7-year-old horror, watched them strangle a dog for cooking. I grabbed the puppy thinking only to save it, but it was so cute that I immediately loved it and would not let it go. How did you feel when you heard that some people strangle and eat dogs? Pause the video here and take a moment and think about that, please. I had never had a dog before, but there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that this dog was meant for me. The village headman who owned the dog was not eager to give it away and had reached to pull it back. Mother, who had been dickering over some carvings she wanted to buy, had seen the man reach for me and had come over like a tigress, ready to attack him, only to find that I would not let the puppy go. "This one," I said again. "I want to save this one." "Save?" Mother asked. "They eat them," I said. "Dogs?" I nodded. "I want to save this one and take it home." She looked from me to the headman, back to me, then nodded and turned back to the headman. "How much?" He stood mute. "How many pesos for the puppy?" He understood that they started to haggle over price. My mother loved it and was in her element. I knew I'd won when she finally nodded, handed the headman some money, and motioned to the Jeep where my father and our bodyguard waited. I do not remember much of the drive back down to base. I sat in the back next to the bodyguard, a sergeant who had just fought through the Second World War, and he was completely bored with me, the puppy, and life, and cuddled the dog. The Jeep was open with the top down, and conversation was nearly impossible at highway speed. But as we neared the base, Father slowed down and Mother turned to me and smiled. "What are you naming her?" I pointed at the white circle on the pup's side. "Snowball." She nodded. "Perfect." Do you think Snowball was a good name for this dog? Pause the video and think about that for just a moment. And so we became friends, Snowball and I, and more than friends. It was a very strange time in my life. I was only 7 and found myself dropped into a world that was in many ways insane. My mother and father were caught up in the whirl of being an officer and an officer's wife involved in some way with the civilian government. This, coupled with the fact that they were getting a good start on their drinking careers, meant that I almost never saw them. And when I did, they were usually not sober. We had a servant named Ram, a young Filipino man who took care of me and when he could. But he had a family of his own, and I was left alone much of the time, or left alone with Snowball. The Philippines had been ravaged by the war, and much of the islands was still in ruins. The people had been devastated, buildings bombed and blown to pieces, whole tracts of land pitted and scarred by battle. It was impossible to walk anywhere without stepping on an empty cartridge case or seeing some part of an exploded shell or mine. There were burned-out tanks and trucks everywhere, old Japanese fighter planes sitting on the ground, buildings blown in half, and all too often a shallow grave or bulldozed trench with bodies in it. This became my playground, and Snowball became my guide. We grew up together. Snowball became an extension of me. I went native, as they said then. I wore army shorts that were miles too big for me, an old army belt holding them up, no shirt, no cap. I sunburned constantly, so I had a Band-Aid over my nose to keep it from peeling all the time, and I evolved into being Filipino. Snowball grew tall in that first year with a thin hound look, one ear flopped down, the other standing straight up, and her tail tightly curved over her back. I took to standing on one leg, my other foot cocked into the knee, one hand holding Snowball's back by the short fur. In many ways, I think I became more dog than human. I would see things, blown apart buildings, old tanks, jeeps upside down, rusting guns everywhere, but Snowball would know things. She would see the obvious outside way a thing looked, but then she would move to it and smell it and perhaps lick it and dig at it and look under it, and I took to doing the same things. I would try to look inside what we were doing, follow Snowball's lead, and in doing this, I found more and saw more than I ever could have alone. We went everywhere, including many places where we were not supposed to be. We found a cave in the jungle full of Japanese bodies, skeletons, and boxes of Japanese money and swords, and rats almost as big as Snowball. We moved through places in Manila where people were so poor and hungry that a whole family lived under a single overturned jeep and had only a handful of rice a day for 6 mouths. Still, they offered us food, even a tiny bit for Snowball, and I took to stealing from my home and taking it to them, and we would sit and talk their language and eat rice and sardines with our fingers, and I would hear of their lives. Snowball next to me as we squatted in the dirt, and how the war had been for them. We watched cockfights where men put 2 roosters in a dusty ring and let them go at each other. Pesos flew around the pit while the men bet money on which rooster would win. We moved outside of town where the farmers wore conical hats and walked through rice paddies with huge water buffalo pulling wooden plows through the mud. Once here, Snowball saved my life. We were walking along a trail where the grass came down next to the dirt in tight clumps. I had gotten ahead of Snowball when she stopped to examine a pile of buffalo droppings. As always, I was barefoot and I was shuffling along. 2 steps ahead, I saw a pretty colored ribbon lying along the trail. Another step closer and I saw it had moved. It wasn't a ribbon but a snake, one that I was to learn later was deadly. Some involuntary signal made me start to jump, but I was too close. I was almost on the snake by that time. It was about to strike when a flash of black fur passed my leg and Snowball grabbed the snake just in the back of the head and with a quick flick broke its neck. It was all over in half a second. Do you think Snowball knew the snake was dangerous when she grabbed it by the neck? Take a moment, pause the video, and think about that, please. I stood, shaking slightly, while Snowball made sure it was dead, threw it off to the side of the trail, and continued on, stopping to look back, one ear up and the other down, her black face questioning, wanting to know why I wasn't coming. At last, I regained some control and followed her. We were in the Philippines 2.5 years, and I can't think of a day I spent without Snowball next to me. In many ways, she became a kind of parent, watching out for me. When I slept, she would crawl up beneath the mosquito netting at the foot of the bed and slept with one part of her touching my foot or leg. The top of her head, her back, a paw, always she slept touching me. And when it came time to go back to the States, I would not agree to go unless and until Mother made arrangements for Snowball to come with us. I made such a fuss that Mother and Father actually went through all the reams of paper it took to bring a dog from the Philippines to the United States. But she did not come. Not 2 weeks before we were due to leave, a military truck swerved and hit her while she was walking next to me. She was killed instantly. I remember standing, not believing she was dead, thinking how nothing would ever be right again, not ever, and how would I always miss her. And that is all true. Now, 49 years later, while I write this, I can see her laughing tongue hanging out while she turned to beckon me on. See the white spot on her side, her tail curled tightly over her back as she turns and jauntily heads up the path ahead of me. And I miss her as much as if she had just died yesterday. Snowball. Your written response for today. When someone dies, information about that person's life is often published in a newspaper, and this is called an obituary. Today, you're going to write an obituary for Snowball. Remember to give some important details. There is an example for you on the written assignment page on Canvas.